as a historian, to me, what happened to Britain in the 1920s, as you know, Britain was in charge of Iraq. It glued Iraq together in the 1920s. And by the end of it, Britain became really a hostage to local players in Iraq. And in fact, the United States is finding itself in the same place as Britain did in the 19th, at the mercy of local players, initially Shiite political leadership. And now the United States is going against the wishes of the Iraqi government and trying to arm some Sunni tribes to fight Al-Qaeda. In fact, the American military presence in Iraq, the preponderant American military presence, has become a liability. A liability against American vested interest. The American presence in Iraq, Bill, I mean, for a person like me, who lives for long periods of time in the Middle East, is not just
born in Beirut, right?
Born in Beirut, and I have spent several years doing field research in the last few years. The way the American mission is perceived in the Muslim world is that this is not about democracy. This is not about a fight against Al-Qaeda. This is a fight to subjugate the Arab and Muslim world and control its resources. And that's why what I find most really alarming, Bill, Al-Qaeda's ideological claims basically are finding receptive ears in that part of the world, because Al-Qaeda is telling Muslims the United States is waging a war against Islam and Muslims. And in fact, what the war itself has done, it has radicalized and militarized a tiny segment of mainstream public opinion.
Tell me, who are these young people you met, the 14, 15-year-olds that you've been interviewing? Give me a vignette of one of them. 14-year-old kid, unemployed, no religious education, no formal education whatsoever. His name is Ahmad. He's telling me he's trying to raise $100 to take a bus ride to the Syrian-Iraqi border and fight the Americans. From Syria. From Syria? From Syria. To go and fight the Americans?
Yes, to fight the Americans. And why? And I asked why. And he said, you're asking me why? You're asking me why I want to go to Iraq? Muslim lands is being occupied by the United States of America. It's my duty, my personal duty. And he's not the only one. Most of my interviews show that these young men had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, had nothing to do with militancy, even though there's ideological mobilization, there's incitement.
What's inspiring them?
You go to any cafe, Bill, outside any mosque, in Algeria, in Yemen, in Syria, in Egypt, and you hear the same, in Jordan, you hear the same talk. That basically, look what the Americans are doing. Not just the American-led invasion and occupation of Iraq, the subsequent revelations, reports about the abuse, the human rights abuse. I mean, I'm shocked sometimes. Some of the kids are telling me American soldiers are raping Iraqi women and Iraqi children. I mean, this is not just one narrative. Multiple sources, including intelligent people who believe in those reports that American soldiers are humiliating, insulting, and raping Iraqi women and children.
With the cadets in class, we walk through some of the jihadi chat rooms that are used to spread propaganda against their fellow soldiers. And they need to understand, there's a photo out there, a very famous photo that's on all of these chat rooms. It's a picture of a bunch of American soldiers taking a rest in a mosque with their boots on. And it's everywhere. And because it's just a symbol of sort of insult to Islam. And the cadets need to understand that even if they are doing something that they think is completely benign, that they don't mean any sort of insult, it can be used against them. And it's that kind of awareness that they need to get to the point where they understand that they could accidentally do something extraordinarily insulting. That photograph is more of a strategic defeat than any sort of tactical engagement on the battlefield. And we need to understand that, and the cadets need to understand that.
Yes, Bill. I mean, I worry about the so-called cultural misunderstandings. I mean, in terms of, going to a mosque with their boots, trying, to insult going into certain homes, the bedrooms. But I think let's also look at the firepower that's being used in Iraq. Look at the number of civilian casualties. When you tell 19-year-old kids, American soldiers, you are fighting evil, the evildoers in Iraq, and you tell them you can use all the firepower at your disposal. No wonder why the number of civilian casualties in Iraq is overwhelming. So while I worry a great deal about the cultural misunderstandings, I also worry about the bigger problem. The problem is, Muslim public opinion is basically bombarded on a daily basis with images of hundreds of Iraqis being killed on a daily basis. And guess what? I hardly met a Muslim, a devout Muslim, who believes that somehow the Iraqis are doing the killings. It's either the Americans or the Mossad who are basically perpetrating sectarian violence in order to dominate.
They're saying
Iraq.
this about Israel,
and the United States. And they say American intelligence, and this tells you about the strategic predicament that we are facing. We are an empire. We are seen as an empire. We are playing empire, and these are the costs of empire.
What would you want the cadets at West Point to know about these young people?
I would like them to know that most of them don't really have $200 to take a bus ride to the Syrian-Iraqi border and join the fight. In fact, really, Bill, if it was not for logistical reasons, for the fact that the United States is putting a great deal of pressure on Arab governments and the lack of resources, the flow of young Muslim men to Iraq would exceed the flow of young Muslim men to Afghanistan in the 1980s. I would tell our American officers that, in fact, this particular fight in Iraq has created a bigger problem, a bigger headache for the United States.
So Iraq has become the new Afghanistan, a breeding ground for terrorists.
Iraq has the potential to become an Afghanistan. In fact, I would go further and say that Iraq has the potential to become a bigger headache than Afghanistan. Iraq is in the heart of the Arab and Muslim world, Bill. Iraq was the caliphate, the Muslim caliphate, for 500 years. Iraq is at the center of the Arabian Islam, and you can imagine how this particular message resonates in the region.
Not only that, but one of the real dangers coming out of Iraq, in Afghanistan in the 1980s, just in terms of the skills that a mujahideen that had gone there to fight learned. They learned a couple of different things. They learned how to organize, they learned how to communicate and work in sort of a multicultural setting, and that people are coming from all over the world. They learned how to ambush Soviet columns in mountain valleys and occasionally shoot down helicopters. In Iraq, the fighters there are learning much more relevant skills, much more dangerous skills.
Such as?
Because they're learning how to build IEDs. They're learning how to...
IEDs are those explosives?
Explosive devices. Yeah. They're learning how to operate in urban settings rather than mountainous settings. They're learning how to communicate covertly when there is a powerful, well-equipped, sophisticated force trying to catch them. In some ways, the individual fighter coming out of Iraq scares me a little bit more than that fighter that came out of Afghanistan 15, 20 years ago, because I think they're going to have more relevant skills to apply to places that we care about, whether it's major cities in the Middle East, Europe, or potentially the United States.
Both of you remind me that the administration lately has been talking less and less about the war on global terrorism, and more about, quote, the long war. What do you make of that?
Well, we don't call it a war against terrorism. We call it a war against al-Qaeda. You know, our class on terrorism starts 2,000 years ago and moves forward. We don't get to al-Qaeda until the last third of the class. There's a lot to learn before you get to al-Qaeda. And we think that that context is important because they need to be able to compare al-Qaeda to something. They need to understand how and why it's similar and how it's different. And so what we tell these cadets is, look, this war against al-Qaeda cannot be won or lost in Iraq. Ultimately, what this is a fight for hearts and minds around the Middle East. And that's a cliche, but it's true. And that's why these cadets, they can't win that fight with an M4.
I mean,
they can't. What do they win it with? In other words, what is the United?
I mean, the question. I mean, the war itself, the global war on terror. I mean, if you really look what Brian said, it's a war against Al-Qaeda. It's a military campaign, a police campaign. This is what's all about. What the administration has done, and I keep coming back to the bigger theme, by expanding the war. The expansion of the war on terror, in fact, has done the opposite from its intended consequences. It has proved to be counterproductive. If our reading of the situation is correct, and you talk to any American intelligence service of officials in Washington, he would tell you, yes, we are losing the war for the hearts and minds of Muslims. If Brian says that I'm going to tell my officers, my cadets, basically to realize this particular war cannot be won on the battlefield, this particular war has to be won in terms of hearts and minds, we are losing this particular war, Bill, because he expanded, the administration, the president expanded the war by over-reliance on militarism, on muscle, military power, instead of using nuance.
But these people, I mean, the president says these were the people killing us on 9/11. How do you deal?
No one is suggesting, telling the president not to use military force against those murderers who basically visited death and horror on our shores on 9/11. What did Iraq have to do with the war on terror? The administration's argument is that we have to stay in Iraq in order to win the war against Al-Qaeda does not make sense. In fact, the opposite is true. The longer we stay in Iraq, the more we help Al-Qaeda spread its ideology and tactics, and Al-Qaeda ideology and tactics are truly spreading into many communities in the Arab and Muslim world.